Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's an honour to be in Auckland and to talk to such a concentration of people who are so involved in China. I think the most important thing, though, for us all to focus on is that the Crayford Farm debate must never happen again. Watching from China and seeing this debate, which was essentially focused around a sense of fear of strangers, a sense of what is perceived as racism, I think demeaned New Zealand considerably. It was unfortunate that it was picked up by aspects of our political establishment, and also unfortunate that it was carried, I would say, by our fringe media, not the sort of things that Fran writes, but some newspapers and in some of the talkback shows carried this story to a point that it did make New Zealand look like a very small and very bigoted country, which we are not. So I think it is incumbent on all of us, next time an acquisition similar to Crayford Farms comes up, we all have to speak up and explain to those in New Zealand who are not as close to business as we are, how important it is that we do welcome in investment from all countries and don't discriminate against China because the investment comes from a country you don't understand. I think at the moment New Zealand is in a good position in pitching to China. About 2 or 3 years ago, we were in quite a weak position in respect of recognising the importance of the Chinese economy to New Zealand. But we have seen in our firm, and we've noticed across the board, the number of companies coming to China and offering really good opportunities for investment. One of the faults, though, is New Zealanders tend to take quite a casual approach to going into other cultures and to presenting the opportunity of New Zealand. And the rather folksy, understated, self-effacing demeanour often doesn't present the story in the way that it really should be presented. So I think one of the disciplines that we all need to focus on is understanding what are the deals that we have to offer. And I think this stretches across the board, regardless of whether one is in a bank or involved in a manufacturing business or looking at some of our more resource-based investments. It's not enough to just turn up and talk New Zealand. Even on a first trip, if possible, it's time to go with deals in hand. The Chinese government is very focused on trying to encourage international investment. And their motives are actually not what some of us have come to conclude. There's a sense that the Chinese want to own our land. Well, I can quote a friend who had a dinner with a vice minister in a crucial ministry in China that covers international investment. He knew this guy had quite a bit to do with New Zealand over the years. This person is not a New Zealander. And he said, don't they understand, all we're looking for really is fibre and protein. We are not looking for a capital gains play in New Zealand. I think that sincerely is the China strategic view. They do not have enough protein. They can't produce enough wool. They can't produce enough trees. They can't actually supply the tremendous growth and demand in their own economy. And New Zealand offers a small portion of this supply. But in the sense of us considering that, we've got to be careful because other countries do too. New Zealanders have a lot of competitors coming out of South America, many of whom are much more open to Chinese investment. They have a greater sense of need because they have more poverty. They've suffered a lot more in the global recession. So it's important that we go with specific offerings. And I think if you look at the pools of money that have built in China, there's one example, for instance, the Beijing government has funded a number of its subsidiary businesses, one particularly in the agricultural sector, where they have literally billions of dollars to invest internationally. And this particular organisation is looking at Australia and New Zealand. Their specialty is agriculture, but they'll look at any deal that has a good return. And any deal where they can justify to their political masters that they're hedging the bets of the Chinese economy. I think one of the things which New Zealanders also can consider, and although I have lived nearly half of my life in China, I'm almost 30 years living in Beijing, I consider myself a New Zealand national who happened by mistake to end up in China, which is actually true. My decision to stay there was perhaps a little more strategic, but I don't live in New Zealand, and so I've got to be very careful in making comments or passing judgments. But what I do see is a country that, in the Chinese mind, represents things that very few other countries can represent, and the things that we've got to be careful not to take for granted. One of the core things is that New Zealand is seen as a very fair country, a very just country. Now, Teo, who has become CEO of Fonterra after the melamine crisis, didn't mention one of the key things that occurred during that crisis. During that crisis, because of the way that Fonterra and the New Zealand government, and MFAT in particular, behaved towards the Chinese government and towards the issues that Fonterra and New Zealand faced in terms of our food safety image, increased New Zealand's standing in China considerably. What was done in this combination of the New Zealand government and Fonterra was to offer the whistle to the Chinese government to blow on their own dairy industry. And there was some criticism that Fonterra took too long to actually announce that they had this problem in their supply chain. We were involved in that process with Fonterra. They're a client of ours. And what was actually going on was that they were looking at the entire dairy industry, because Sanlu was a very small player compared to the giants of Ely and Mengniu, who have the duopoly that dominate the industry. And melamine was throughout the supply chain. There was actually more melamine in the ice cream that was being sold by Mengniu than there was in the infant formula being sold by Sanlu. So Fonterra realised that if they announced this issue immediately, and they were involved in a product recall, then everyone would run for cover. And actually, the industry was preparing to run for cover when the New Zealand government, through the then ambassador to Beijing, Tony Brown, contacted the Chinese authorities and presented the information. Within 48 hours, the Chinese shut down their own dairy industry, and thousands of children's lives were saved. That's New Zealand's legacy in terms of the food safety crisis. That was melamine. So we have something very strong to build on at a government level. Beyond that, actually New Zealand is not that well known in China. We like to tell ourselves that we're the little country that everyone respects and we punch above our weight, and there's a string of cliches we use to describe ourselves. But actually, we have a lot of work to do to create brand New Zealand in China. But this has been a good start. And I think that it is an obligation on all of us to, with some modesty, look at the scale of China, look at the pace of its development, and make a decision that we have collectively a marketing job to do. And if we find ourselves in competition with someone else from our same sector, look how we can collaborate. There's a wonderful statement by Michael Stedman, who has a huge business in China, much larger than many people realize in documentaries with Natural History New Zealand. He said, "The moment I climb on an aeroplane, I consider myself without competitors from New Zealand. I only have collaborators." And I've found at times, and it's uncomfortable, that you see people in your own sector doing things. But if you communicate with them, you can realize that we're not going to compete with each other in international markets. We're too small. You know, we're a country that is the size of a fragment of Beijing City. I can walk around the equivalent of the population of New Zealand from my apartment in central Beijing in about 40 minutes to an hour if I walk swiftly. So we're really very tiny. You know, we're not a country that China thinks about a great deal. We are not a country that is important to China. But we've got to be careful, because there are pressures coming on us, pressures that to be seen as a destination that is welcoming for Chinese investment, not just in its commercial environment, but also in its political environment. What choices will we make in terms of our alliances? We are currently perceived by China, which is another plus, as a non-aligned nation. What are the true few real non-aligned nations in the canon of developed countries in the OECD? The problem is that as the pressure grows in Asia, and as America enters into what is the equivalent of a Cold War with China, and it started already, and as they get out of the Middle East, it will increase. A very Cold War, not something to be alarmed about, just the way that powers behave. We must be careful we do not draw too close to anybody. We cannot be seen to be a sop to China because it is so definitive of our own economic well-being, but neither can we draw back and be too close to Washington. We must be very, very careful, and our government must be vigilant that it doesn't end up signing those one too many memos that in the end destroys this crucial position of non-alignment that we are perceived as by China. I think many Asian countries see us as being this truly independent country. That, therefore, presents us as not a crucial, but as an important by sector trade partner for China and investment destination. We have many assets which currently the Chinese could invest in. Our forestry industry is an example. Our wool industry is an example. You know, we're at a point where we could not just save, but we could stem the actual devolution of New Zealand's strong wool, coarse wool, and rebuild to become a value-added player with the perception of having the best strong wool in the world. And this is certainly something that within China, they're worried that because of all countries are losing this ability to keep farmers producing this product because it gets put down as a cheap commodity, when actually it's a very value-added product in the Chinese furnishing sector. These opportunities are very good for us, and we should be attracting Chinese capital around such things as processing, not only in New Zealand, but also in partnership in China. The other areas that we should be considering is the forestry sector, much broken down over the years in terms of a loss of processing. Again, the Chinese don't have to own the land under the trees. All they need to do is to be allowed to have the milling rights for the trees and to use and we can create conditions that they actually invest in our processing. There are many in China who are concerned that New Zealand logs or logs from anywhere turn up and require a huge amount of electricity and water to process. We have that electricity and water, and we can add more value to our timber exports if we can actually process in New Zealand. So we're at a critical stage in terms of our position in the world. I think we have been slow as a country to realise that what is happening in Europe and what is happening in the United States is actually a lot worse, much worse than even television reports or newspaper reports will tell us. I think both those regions of the world have deluded themselves as to the extent of injury that they've suffered in the global economic crisis. And I'm not an economist, but I would say that for 10 years, both those regions will be in either stagnation or will be dipping in and out of recession. So we really have to galvanise ourselves as a country and look to our true status as a Southern Asian nation and focus not only on China. The other aspect is we should be hedging our bets, and I think we are in our trade policy doing that by entering into free trade agreements with India and Indonesia. And these are crucial for us because we must be very careful we do not allow ourselves to become too dependent on China. There is a history of dependence in New Zealand's trade history. If we think of our long period of being very dependent on Britain, we almost risk it now in terms of Australia. You know, Australia is the easy market for us to go to and the easy market for us to seek partnership in. But I think we have to be bolder and reach further afield. And so in that sense, China remains a crucial player for New Zealand. I think one thing to be careful of is Chinese culture. It's a mistake that I've made many times and I still make, and that is that I misunderstand Chinese hospitality, Chinese warmth and generosity. You visit a province with a client who has the means to invest, maybe not that substantially, but maybe you go to a village or to a small town where your $5–10 million investment is going to make a real difference. And you are very well treated. You are banqueted, you are taken to show the temple on the hill. You're made to feel like you're the most important person that's turned up in that part of the world for perhaps a generation. But actually, it's just the way the Chinese people are at welcoming in strangers. But often New Zealanders, having experienced that, return back to New Zealand and return to their own companies with a sense that I've got a deal. Mr. Wong met me at the airport and he's the party secretary of the city. The trouble is you don't have a deal. It takes a very long time for us to cross into a culture like China's and for us to understand what it is we're dealing with in the people, what it is we're dealing with in the commercial opportunity. But it takes them just as long to come to understand us, as poor Zhang Jiaobai has found out to his great cost in his attempt to acquire the Crayford Farms. These cross-cultural processes are extremely detailed. They're not easily described. You often hear people talking about the sort of 5 main points in terms of how do you deal in China. And there is this word guanxi. which is thrown out and it's said with delight. I've got a Chinese word, I can use it. And it actually means relationships. It doesn't mean anything more than relationships. In fact, it's so fundamental to human interaction, it's a pity that it's seen as a concept that is actually alien to our culture, because we're a deeply relationship-driven country. And I think if we just look at that aspect, we can often find that the things that matter in these other cultures are very similar to our own, but they're just juxtaposed differently. One of my experiences, and I'm in my mid-50s, is in dealing with people in business or local politicians in China who have had an entirely different life than I've had. When they were children, they experienced the Cultural Revolution. Perhaps relations disappeared. They were hungry. They remember what it was to have a glass of milk a week. Well, I was worrying about the length of my hair or whether I was allowed to stay out late at night and date girls when I was too young to do so. I mean, the sort of middle class, I would say, indulgence, the softness of my upbringing compared to the harshness and the suffering and that need that those things create in people on my Chinese counterpart side was quite a revelation to me. So I think as we perceive China, we must be careful and make sure we don't take too much for granted that first flush of welcoming, that first period of time that we spend in the country in our attempts to do business. It's an expensive country to do business in. For some of you, it is better you don't go to China because you may not have the resources in a financial sense. You may also not have the resources in terms of your management. Even with the money, if you think what it takes one person in a day to process in terms of communication, thinking through strategy, the requirements in the China market are much more long-winded. It takes a lot longer to get things done than it does, say, going to Australia or the UK or to the US. So one of the things about approaching the China market is to actually make sure that you make an objective choice. Don't let your distributor give you all the information on the market. We had a person recently we were dealing with from a New Zealand wine company who was so excited because they just sold 3,000 cases of wine to China. It's a lot of wine. But they had no idea it was being sold, who was drinking it and why. And so in a sense, they'd sold their wine into an absolute vacuum. They wanted to increase their business with China, and yet they were getting extremely good margins in London and in Los Angeles. And our advice to them was, make sure you really understand what the depth of that market is first. And make sure you do some projections that you're going to make more money selling to Shanghai and Beijing than you are to the States or to the UK. So in many cases, we've got to be careful of the China opportunity as much as we must entertain it and realise how important it is for New Zealand. But Fran asked me to focus on incoming investment, and I've drifted off the point. I think finally, be careful of how we look at Chinese purchases so far. Chinese companies have purchased stressed assets in New Zealand. PGG Wrightson was in major trouble when China made its investment. Fisher & Paykel would not exist today if China had not bought 20% of it. Let's not worry about losing some special IP from Fisher & Paykel. Because Hire invested in that business, a New Zealand manufacturer endures, will continue to innovate, to design, employ people in New Zealand who are highly qualified. And then if we look at the Crayford Farm deal, which is another example, what's the problem of swapping Australian debt for Chinese equity? I mean, the conversation around Crayford Farm was actually ludicrous on that front. That business had already gone to Australian interests because the banks owned it. So far, it's the stressed assets that have sold. And to go back to my first point, it's crucial now that we take good, solid, healthy assets, we go into the China market and we find investors that can irrigate our economy with really good cash, long-term patient cash, and form partnerships from strength, and not just wait until our companies falter and there's no one else to give us money but a Chinese company looking for deals.